Advertising is inescapable. But despite its ubiquity in modern Western culture, I've often seen people dismiss its influence as at best benign and at worst annoying. Unfortunately, a relentless stream of Raid Shadow Legends sponsors is far from the worst thing advertising has contributed to the world. The truth is that the modern advertising industry has become so effective that its influence is not only omnipresent, but subliminal. Consumer psychology, the large amounts of money, and advances in technology have fundamentally turned advertising into the most widespread and effective propaganda machine in the modern world. The messages we get fed through advertising become so ingrained that we mistake them for objective human truths, which has dire consequences for society at large. To truly appreciate the insidious nature in which advertising becomes a part of the public conscious, we first have to understand what makes an advertisement successful. At its core, an advertisement doesn't want to sell you a product, they want to sell you an idea. When Nike says just do it, they're not just selling you shoes, they're selling you an idea of what it takes to be a successful athlete and tying that identity back to their brand. Apple's Mac vs. PC ad campaigns sold the idea of what it means to be young and hip. Old Spice's The Man Your Man Could Smell Like sold the idea of what it takes to be quote-unquote masculine. Yes, in each of those cases, the respective companies were selling products consumers liked. The success of each campaign can largely be attributed to the powerful ideas that each ad represented. While Nike's Max and Old Spice deodorants existed well before each of those campaigns, their sales all skyrocketed post-launch. And this isn't me just getting esoteric or reading into the subtext of advertising. Crack open an Intro to Marketing textbook or do a quick Google search and they'll all tell you the same thing. The power of an advertisement comes not from the product itself, but the ideas, values, and stories the advertisement is attempting to portray. To simplify this even further, each idea an advertisement represents can be distilled to one powerful underlying message. What is the common ground between athletic performance, being young, and being, quote, a man? Happiness. Every advertisement is trying to sell you happiness. They're not selling you a product. They're selling a story, a connection, love, friendship, and they want you to believe you need what they're selling in order to get those things. I want you to picture an engagement ring. If you're in the United States, chances are most of you imagined a diamond ring. That's not an accident. As of 2022, diamonds remain the overwhelmingly popular choice for engagement ring center stones in the United States. But it wasn't always like that. Back in the 1930s, as a result of the Great Depression, diamond sales were on the decline, and generally, consumers thought of them as a luxury for the wealthy. This prompted diamond company De Beers to reach out to the advertising agency N.W. Ayer & Son with a bold goal: create a situation where almost every person pledging marriage feels compelled to acquire a diamond engagement ring. Spoiler alert, they were successful. In fact, they were so successful at ingraining the idea that marriage went hand in hand with diamond rings that the advertising became self-sustaining. Any TV show or movie that involves the purchasing of a diamond engagement ring is technically propaganda for the diamond industry, even if the creatives behind the show didn't intend for it to be. This is a useful framework to keep in mind as we explore this idea further. The ad campaign starts with a central powerful idea, the lines between the idea and the product begin to blur, and eventually that idea is so closely tied to the product that society itself will continue to reinforce it without an explicit marketing push. Think about the culture around cars in the United States. The way some people gender them, the obsessive collecting, and stereotypes that form around certain car owners. We fucking love cars. It's almost like we think of cars as a person, as a loved one, and that's not an accident. There's a surprisingly common through line in a lot of advertising surrounding cars, the equating of motor vehicle ownership with romantic love.
Ford dealer and fall in love today.
These commercials are weird as shit. You can even see a shift in how cars were marketed right around the time vehicle manufacturing increased in the 1950s. Before that, most advertising around vehicles focused on the actual utility of one vehicle over another, which, is what advertising is supposed to be. But post-World War II, manufacturers ramped up vehicle production, and the increased supply necessitated a change in how vehicles were marketed. It was during the 1950s when America's car culture developed and has maintained to this day. But okay, both diamonds and cars are objects. We can have a debate about how fundamental those things may be related to someone's identity or core values. Is there something deeper we can point to? At some point in our lives, we have all been a teenager. I've yet to meet anyone who doesn't draw a distinction between childhood, adulthood, and teenagerhood. We think of being a teenager as its own time in our development, its own stage of life. The distinct culture around teenagers forms a societal role that necessarily manifests an identity unique from childhood and adulthood. But even this cultural identity, something that feels so ingrained, objective, and natural, has its origins in advertising. The existence of a teenage culture distinct from childhood and adulthood didn't really become a thing until the mid-20th century. What we now consider teenagers were just thought of as children, and youth culture encompassed people into their 30s. The rapid economic expansion in post-World War II America led to adolescents having more buying power than they had in the past, and advertisers took note of a gap in the market that they could exploit. It was in the mid-20th century that marketers and advertisers started targeting this teenage market explicitly, eventually solidifying the distinct cultural identity that teenagers have in modern day. I'm not saying that wanting a diamond ring, liking a certain car, or being a teenager are bad things. I'm not even saying that liking and buying things is bad. Look, believe it or not, I like things. Rather, I wanted to point out how all these things feel natural despite them being products of advertising. This is what you need to express your love. This is a suitable replacement for human relationships, and this is how you separate yourself from children and adults. And that is what I want to talk about. When advertising becomes so ingrained that we mistake it for objective truth. But the thing is, that's what advertisers want. Do you prefer Coke or Pepsi? Do you know why you like one over the other? Most of us would assume that it's all about the taste, right? But there's some compelling evidence that the preference may not be that simple. In 2004, a study was conducted in which subjects, while hooked up to an fMRI machine, would perform a taste test of both Coke and Pepsi. Despite the majority of the subjects claiming to have a preference for Coke, a blind taste test evenly split the group when it came to taste preference. But when the subjects were told which drinks were which, the majority preference went back to Coke. Interestingly, the results of the fMRI scans also showed different parts of the brain would react upon ingestion depending on if the subjects knew they were drinking Coke or not. And that does make sense. Coca-Cola's advertising is so effective and ubiquitous that many Americans use the term Coke to refer to any soda. It's a core part of Americans' iconography, to the point where, as that 2004 study showed, Coke's brand reputation was arguably more important than its actual taste when it came to individual preference. This is extremely important to keep in mind. With the abundance of advertising media we're exposed to, we can't ever be quite sure about why we like one product over the other or why we associate certain brands with certain values, especially as advertising has become more sophisticated with how it delivers its message. Effective advertising isn't quite the same beast that it was in the early 20th century. I've often seen people dismiss all advertising as ineffective because it's annoying or too in their face, even making them dislike the product that's being advertised. But the thing is, that's the advertising you noticed. Companies regularly spend billions of dollars every year on marketing campaigns, with budgets that have only gone up since the 20th century. To say that this is ineffective is to ignore the reality of how these businesses operate. They would not be spending this money if they didn't see a return. Advertising is very much effective, but to truly understand why, we have to recontextualize our layman understanding of how it works, and look at the methods advertisers have been using in the 21st century century. The bloat of the advertising industry necessitates more intrusive and subtle forms of advertising. In many ways, the advertising industry itself is its own worst enemy. Ad creep on traditional television channels has turned many to drop cable in favor of online streaming. Overbearing commercials with obvious salesman energy are more likely to turn potential buyers off from your product. The advertising industry wants your attention, and they want it without you noticing. Integrated product placement in television and movies is the norm. People are paid by liquor companies to post up at bars and talk up the brand. There are some cities in America that have begun selling space on police cars for ads. Next time you go outside, pay attention to your surroundings and count how long it takes before you're exposed to an advertisement. Brands get mentioned in school textbooks, sponsored districts, and get their products to be a regular part of lunch programs. A kid was even suspended for wearing a Pepsi shirt to a school-sponsored Coca-Cola rally. What does that say about the values we're instilling? A relatively new and particularly dystopian advertising model known as neuromarketing is also gaining increasing popularity. Based on the astonishing hypothesis from neuroscientist Francis Crick that human consciousness and all associated emotions and thoughts are just a result of neural activity, neuromarketing attempts to reverse engineer that process and figure out exactly what brain activity leads to consumption. That Coke versus Pepsi study I mentioned earlier is, in part, an effort to advance the science of neuromarketing. Now, even though neuromarketing is not the norm yet, advertisers have been hijacking the human brain for decades. Consumer psychology has been a powerful tool for marketers and is only becoming more sophisticated and harder to notice as technology advances and we deepen our understanding of the human brain. Now, I bring all this up to make 2 points. One, you are being influenced by advertising, even if you think you aren't. And two, that isn't a reflection of your intelligence, and it shouldn't make you feel bad about yourself. My intention here isn't to shame or belittle. I'm as influenced by advertising as anyone else. That's the point. The deck is stacked against us. There's a multi-billion-dollar apparatus designed with the sole purpose of taking advantage of how our brains function, and it seamlessly and effortlessly infiltrates all other forms of media. For most of my adult life, I've thought of advertising as a necessary evil, a monetary vehicle that is the price to pay for the plethora of media options we have to choose from. An entity that may be intrusive, but is still wholly separate from the media we like. And if that were simply all advertising was, I wouldn't have too many objections about it. But where does the advertising apparatus stop and other forms of media begin? If a TV network, newspaper, or social media platform makes most of their revenue from ads, are they not part of the advertising industry? Advertising, both explicitly and implicitly, dictates what kind of news coverage we get, which shows get greenlit and renewed, and what videos YouTube pushes. The irony is not lost on me that if this video is successful, it's only because YouTube has deemed it a good vehicle to get you to watch ads. Is the news we care about actually what's important, or are networks and outlets just pandering to advertisers? Is Mr. Beast popular because he makes good content that appeals to a wide number of people, or is he a perfect vehicle for getting eyes on advertisements? Is what is deemed family-friendly actually what we as a society have deemed acceptable for all ages, or is it what advertisers have deemed acceptable for all ages? I don't have an answer to any of that, and that's not the point. The scary part is that advertising is so ingrained in Western culture that it's impossible to say if these values are formed by culture and reflected in advertising, or formed by advertising and reflected in culture. Now, I just want to make it clear that I don't believe the advertising industry has some kind of ideological bias that they're attempting to push into mainstream culture. The shaping of political and social values by advertising is more of an inadvertent result of what the industry actually wants. The entire advertising apparatus exists to get you to tie your identity to commodity consumption. Its goal is to sell you things by creating an intrinsic link between who you are as a person and the stuff you buy. way. The natural repercussion of that business model is the wearing away of society's intrinsic values, meaning a value that exists for its own sake, like a sense of community and self-acceptance, and replacing them with extrinsic values like image and power. It's not a coincidence that countries who get exposed to Western media see an increase in things like body dysmorphia. Modern advertising isn't simply about pointing out why this product is better than that product. We produce too much, and more deep-seated and powerful emotions need to be exploited in order to sell the massive amount of commodities that are manufactured. The unfortunate truth is that happiness through commodity consumption doesn't work. Production and consumption have risen considerably over the 20th and 21st centuries, yet hyper-consumerist countries like the United States consistently report declining quality of life in nearly all measurable metrics. Personally, I believe those 2 points are largely intertwined. We've seen studies that show a link between sadness and increased consumption, and that the happiness that comes with material purchases is fleeting. It creates a feedback loop of dissatisfaction, a yearning for material possessions to fill in that emptiness, despite the fact that those material possessions are creating it. It's an equation that can't be solved. Beyond the very tangible threats hyperconsumption present to the labor force and planet, there is something even deeper in the human psyche that consumption has been withering away at: the very idea of what it means to be human. It aims to replace community, friendship, and love with Bluetooth-equipped sedans and sugary drinks. The entire advertising apparatus exploits, creates, and maintains a general, unrelenting dissatisfaction with life, because that dissatisfaction is what leads people to consume, and they just happen to be selling the thing that will finally make you happy.